Hi, my name is Cheryl Yoder, and I am a volunteer with AARP Nebraska. For the month of February, AARP has invited the curator of collections from the Hastings Museum to share 4 informational sessions with us on the topic of quilts. Depending on whom you ask, there is as few as 24 traditional quilt patterns up to over 400. No matter the pattern, one thing is certain. Each quilt illustrates the maker's ability to meld colors and prints together into a cohesive design. Along the way, they may incorporate pieces of a personal story or memory that makes the quilt more meaningful to them or the person for whom they're making it. In this 4-part series, Teresa Kreutzer-Hodson shares the beauty and history of some of the fantastic quilts held in the Hastings Museum's permanent collection. Today is part 3 of the series, expanding on the embroidery methods used in crazy quilts. This episode will also feature a number of signature quilts. In some cases, the signatures were embroidered into the quilt, while others were simply written. One of the more interesting pieces in the collection is a signature quilt featuring names of veterans of the War of 1812, Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. You can view this 4-part series on quilts from our AARP Nebraska Facebook page live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time during the month of February. After each event, we will save the recorded segments that we have aired on our Facebook page. Our next upcoming event on quilts will be featured on February 24th, and it will shift away from pieced quilts to look at applique quilts. Teresa will end out this series sharing tips on how you can care for your own quilts and keep them preserved for the next generation. If you're watching this segment, please post a comment, like, or share our AARP Nebraska Facebook page so that your friends can watch and learn too. Now let's get started by meeting Teresa Kreutzer-Hodson from the Hastings Museum. Welcome, Teresa.
I want to thank AARP for allowing us to present our quilt programs to you. We appreciate you tuning in, and this is a 4-part series. We are on number 3 today, and we are going to talk about embroidered quilts, which will include our signature or friendship quilts. We have about 80 quilts in our collection, so this series we are able to share quite a few of our quilts, and we hope that you're enjoying this. Let's get started with our embroidery quilts. So there's a lot of different signature quilts that we have in our collection, and all of them have unique histories with their backgrounds and stuff, but this particular one is just really a doozy. It is a military friendship quilt. Friendship quilts as a whole were originally started in about the 1840s in the New England area, and they remained popular through the Midwest and Great Plains well into the 1900s here in this area. Sometimes they were given for weddings or other special occasions. Sometimes it was when people moved away. This particular one doesn't have a lot of embroidery. It actually has the indelible ink used for the signatures. So sometimes they have embroidery, sometimes they have ink, sometimes they have both. So like I said, this one is a military service quilt. And the story that came to us on this quilt was that it was made in the early 1800s. In looking at this quilt and kind of doing some research, and also having Sandy Fox in her survey look at it, it's more likely that this quilt was made in the late 1800s and not the early 1800s. There are 20 blocks made up of the chevron here. It is 69 by 82, so it's a good sized quilt, and it is just covered with names, as you can see in this picture here. So the original story for this said that this quilt belonged to Benjamin von Grundy and was later given to Simon Young, whose name is embroidered or is inked on, and then there's that embroidered red box around it in the center of this picture. Von Grundy was a military veteran of the War of 1812, but we really don't know that much more about him. Whether he actually owned this quilt or not is really up for debate. Simon Young, we actually know quite a bit about. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1840. He and several of his brothers enlisted in the military and fought on the Union side of the Civil War, including some of his brothers serving with him in the same company, which was Company D of the 93rd Illinois Infantry, which isn't totally unusual, but certainly to have, I think there were 3 brothers that served in that same company was a little bit unusual, in that sometimes they just spread them out, so if one of them died, they wouldn't all die out of the family. Anyway, Simon Young served, like I said, in the Civil War. He was wounded at Champion Hill in Mississippi in 1863. And we know that he filed a claim for disability on his pension because of this wound. After the war, he took a land claim in Johnson County, Nebraska, and he married a woman from Nebraska City. They eventually moved to Bethany, Nebraska around 1900. Simon died in 1920 and is buried in Lincoln, Nebraska. According to the Nebraska Civil War Veterans Database, he belonged to the Gar Post 25 in Lancaster County. Although I'm still trying to piece together all the names on this quilt and kind of trying to figure out where they come from or why their names are on this quilt, I do kind of have a working theory that perhaps at least part of these people were from that GAR post. When you look at these, and you can kind of see in the picture here, you can see that they listed out their companies, and they are from various states, including there's one from the 1st Nebraska, which was a military group from Nebraska during the Civil War. To have all these people come together and not be related really kind of lends to the theory that, this probably had something to do with the Grand Army of the Republican post that was there in Lancaster County. Still trying, like I said, still trying to piece it together, and someday maybe I'll get the tie that definitively tells me where these gentlemen came from. Nevertheless, just a very interesting piece. It isn't in the greatest condition. The edges are kind of starting to fray, and some of this ink is starting to fade. So we have recorded all the names that are visible, so we can continue to do that research. Another one of our older signature quilts was made around 1900 by members of Juniata's Methodist Church, the Epworth League. It appears that each person embroidered their own signature because there's different styles, there's different levels of skills that are seen in those names. The Epworth League was a precursor to the Methodist Youth Fellowship. It started in about 1889 with the intent of training young church members in the practice of the church and include both males and females. Most of the names that are on this quilt are from females. Some are married and some are not. So we really don't know exactly why they made this quilt. Perhaps it is because they were doing a fundraiser. Margaret Eberhardt purchased this quilt in 1903, and she presumably purchased it from the Epworth League, which makes us think that it might have been something done for a fundraiser. This is a cotton quilt, and it does measure about 65 by 82, so it's a pretty good size quilt. This next quilt is also done in that red and white and very stunning with a lot of different motifs in it. It is made out of cotton and it came back to Hastings by way of Minnesota in 1998. So it is one of our more recent acquisitions. It was passed down through the Harry Clay Haverly family. Harry arrived in Hastings in 1879, and in 1886 he married Carrie, and they had 2 sons, one being the father of the donor of this quilt. Again, we don't really know precisely why this quilt was made. Perhaps it was offered when Harry briefly left Hastings to manage a store in Culberson. Again, we don't know for sure, but maybe it was also tied to his service as a public servant for Adams County once he came back to Hastings. There are many signatures on here that we can identify as prominent people that were business owners in Hastings. For example, there was J. McGrath, hardware store owner, W.B. Cushing, who was a proprietor of a grocery wholesale house. There was A.W. Bindrup's name on here. He operated a grocery store. Croft and Rinsbacher are also on here. They were a prominent butcher house for many years. And then on this piece, you can see on the right side picture, you can see that W.E. Kipp in there. Kipp and Evans were cigar manufacturers here in Hastings. So, like I said, some pretty prominent names, but we really don't know why they made this quilt. And they didn't just do signatures. There are these different motifs that are all around the quilt, and just very interesting to look at, and makes that quilt very stunning. Now, we covered crazy quilts in our last session, but this one I included because it's a crazy signature quilt. So like all the other signature quilts, there's embroidery pieces and irregular shapes that make up this quilt. But the unusual thing is the various signatures on it. This was made in about 1908, and it was given to Rachel Sadler when she and her husband moved from Adams County, Nebraska to Washington State. So these are ladies that she would have been friends with in their time here in Hastings. Rachel only lived in Juniata for about 10 years, but obviously she made some good friends and had a sister or sister-in-law named Julia Sadler that has her signature here on the quilt as well. Rachel's grandson donated this quilt in 2003 to the museum, and one of the things that he said is that she had always treasured this quilt, and he said he didn't really have any ties because he had never lived in Nebraska, but the reason he donated it to the Hastings Museum was because it had come from this area, and we are certainly glad that he did, because it does add to just the array and variety of quilts that we have here. This is another one of our signature quilts that has embroidery motifs as well as the names. There are 12 blocks in this cotton quilt that was made by the women of the First St. Paul's Lutheran Church in about 1947. The ladies presented this quilt as a going-away present to Reverend Dr. F.C. Schuld and his family when he moved on to another church. The quilt was returned to the church in 2009, and wanting to preserve the quilt and its history, the church donated it to the Hastings Museum that same year. Like I said, it is an example of a signature quilt that also has a motif to it of the flowers, and that flower is repeated. They did a very symmetric layout with the flowers, and also with their signatures, the way they incorporated them around the flowers. Again, if you look closely, there are some names in this quilt that you can identify as definite people who were from the Hastings area, and possibly were business owners or wives of business owners during that time. Wanted to try and give you a little bit of a look at the quilting that was done here, and you can kind of see it a little bit on the edging there. One of the things about these quilts is this one isn't very thick, and you can kind of see the borders from the front side showing through on the back in that kind of pink area, but it also kind of shows you all of the quilting styles that were used to put this together. So embroidery quilts, other than signature quilts, have a more recent history than a lot of the piece quilts. Transfer design patterns were sold through magazines or newspapers in the 1920s and 30s, kind of making them a little more popular. And the quilt patterns weren't just limited to embroidery kits. Sometimes they also had fabric pieces that came with them that were already cut out. A lot of these quilts could be sewn together quite easily at home if they were kits, and it did open up a whole new job market for designers. So they could design these pieces that they would send out for you to iron onto your piece fabric so that you can embroider it, as well as just these kits that they put together. This is one that was made possible through the Omaha World Herald. It's the Covered Wagon State Quilt. All of the motifs that are around here have something to do with the state or the surrounding states here in this area. Marie Perkins made this quilt in 1940, and she used this pattern that was published by the Omaha World Herald, as well as other national newspapers. They published this between October of 1939 and February of 1940. Marie herself was a teacher in Kennesaw before moving to California in the 1940s. This quilt, the patterns and stuff that they used would be published one at a time. So you'd get Buffalo Bill one day and the Dugout the next, or the next week. It depicts a lot of the legends and myths of the Western travel and the expansion by using stereotyped characters. So there is one that I did include of a couple of the Lakota chiefs, very stylized, and it kind of puts that Hollywood shine on the West that many people have come to accept. It really kind of fails to show some of the hardships. Even though they have the dugout here, it doesn't really show what it was really like to live out here. Also, just the displacement of the indigenous people. You know, it's, like I said, it's a very Hollywood look to this quilt. Nevertheless, Marie did a great job with quilting this, and I love that when you flip it over, you can actually see the designs on the back. So this is, on the right side, is the image of Buffalo Bill that you saw in the previous slide, outlined in the embroidery stitches, or the quilting stitches, around the edges here. This quilt is very likely the Bird Life Audubon quilt. This was a pattern that was made possible through another distribution of either magazines or other periodicals where you could send away for this. The birds on this quilt were embroidered by Mary Friesenborg and Hannah Coleman. They were from Gothenburg, Nebraska, and they included the date of 1938 on this quilt. So the design of this quilt is possibly made by Ruby McKim, who was a pretty prominent pattern seller for quilts. She started a business with her husband and became quite popular with publishing her patterns in her own books in the early 1900s. You can see the quilting on the back of this and see all the fine designs that were made. We don't have an example of a liquid embroidery quilt or anything here. We do have some pillowcases and stuff, but liquid embroidery also became a way of decorating quilts and became really popular in like about the 1960s. Instead of using threads, they would use the transfer patterns that you could purchase and then use a liquid fabric paint to outline those designs and then sometimes fill them in. The paint came in tubes in a wide variety of colors. There was Artex and Trichemical, who were a couple of the two bigger companies that sold these patterns. So when you look at some of these, you can tell that they weren't embroidered, but they are called the liquid embroidering method. Again, I want to thank AARP for partnering with the Hastings Museum on this project to present our quilts. We do appreciate all of the work that they do to help us out. This has been the third of 4 parts to our quilt collection presentation. I do hope that you come back next time for our final presentation on applique quilts, as well as tips to help you preserve your own quilts. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.